Ah, came a voice adjacent to them. Sirius's grin seemed to indicate he had just witnessed the exchange between them. Aberforth told you about little Freya? Tunks is doing a wonderful foster mother job, but I just thought she needed to be someone a little less inexperienced? Asked Remus, chuckling a little. Clueless, corrected Sirius. But she did seem to be very attached to the book you gave her, Remus. He continued. Grimelda's her favorite, so I hear. Mysterious mythology, whispered Cecilia, half to herself. Remus nodded a little but continued his conversation with Sirius. Of course. There's nothing like Grimelda. I'm just glad it has been put to some use after my father locked it away. You know, he blamed that book on Kay's condition. I'm just so happy that it's gone to a good home. Cecilia looked away from her focus. She had not been listening to what Remus was saying but had been staring at Snape, who was in deep conversation with Tabitha, next to Sirius. Genius, that man, commented Sirius. Though you wouldn't know it. Very modest about everything. Cure for lycanthropy before he was even out of school. Not that you took the mick, reminded Remus. No, replied Sirius, shaking his head. Well, not much. Quite simple though, using silver. A silver salt compound in solution taken on a lunar eclipsed full moon, enough to aquify the proteins in the DNA and, as the body fights it, the tidal effect of the water in the body cells change, making the DNA change and alleviating the body of lycanthropy. There. She had said it. Those long days sitting around in the Dursleys' house waiting for either Dudley Dursley to come home and try to resist any attempt of hers to teach him or attempting to stave off desperately thoughts of her Remus. She knew both he in this reality and Sirius were staring at her, but she didn't care. She had formulated this too, and it had been too long sitting on a shelf in her mind, time to be aired. Brutal and painful, but it works, growled Snape, who had also been paying attention. So, you're a scientist, Mrs. Frobisher, said James, nodding as Sirius replaced Lily next to him. You're a scientist, Mrs. Frobisher, imitated Sam, copying his father and making one last, but successful attempt to climb on Cecilia, jumping on her lap and grinning as only children of such an age can. His father gave her an apologetic look and lifted him off Cecilia, much to the objection of his son. We have talked about this, we do not do that to strangers, Sammy, he chided. But she's not a stranger, Daddy, he protested, she's a scientist, prompted Sirius as James made shushing noises to his son. You know, I've always been interested in time travel. Do you think science could make that happen? There are limits to science. Cecilia smiled. I'm assuming you mean traveling in time in other directions rather than just the usual way, past to future. Sirius nodded, seemingly swallowing the sarcastic rebuke that Cecilia expected. Reality is always changing because more than one thing at a time is changing. If you are to believe some, there are alternate realities all stemming from one place and branching out. You don't believe that? Asked Remus, doubtfully. The trousers of time has been a long-held hypothesis. Not that everything starts at one point, clarified Cecilia, brushing her hair out of her face. It had been a long day and she could feel tiredness creeping up on her as she sat there discussing her ideas. Although science holds this, the Big Bang Theory, that everything is connected to everything else. She looked at Sirius. I am almost certain that science will be involved in it somewhere along the line. Do you envisage using this in my work with Mr. Snape? Who knows? Shrugged Sirius. Now he's solved the universal link, I can't see there's much more for him to investigate. That can't be right, replied James, shaking his head at his friend. Otherwise why would Aberforth have recommended Mrs. Frobisher? Cecilia spent the next hour listening to how Severus Snape and Tabitha Penright had formulated the link. It wasn't how she would have done it, or rather, how she had done it. They hadn't looked at mysterious mythology, but they had information gleaned from reciprocators in their respective scientific fields. Good old Aberforth Dumbledore, thought Cecilia as the tale unfolded around her. To insist on its investigation by a mole scientist, as his brother had done before, that was one good thing. Another was that she was going to be mum to Freya, her darling friend's daughter, and live at Hedgewood's. And a third was that she would be there to teach science. That's what you're doing, at Hedgewood's, is it? Cecilia realized that Sirius was staring at her. He was now standing up next to James, who was in the middle of catching hold of his son, Sirius beaming around at them and nodding. Cecilia looked at him blankly. She had been lost in her own thoughts as she tried to incorporate all that was here into her mind. It was going to be difficult not sticking her foot in it with those around her who, to an extent, she knew so well. Well, you joining us, doing whatever you did behind the veil, Severus's link, Aberforth's school admission. This calls for a celebration. A party. A groan from beside her caused Cecilia to look at Remus, and she saw him roll his eyes towards James. Well, she was just going to have to get on with it, and get used to the now. Mick and Minerva should be here soon, said Tabitha, nodding towards the fireplace. I can go and help Molly and Arthur prepare. Can't see a problem. She looked at James and Remus, who had balked at the idea of a party. Both of them shook their heads innocently, which made Sirius beam. Then a party it is, declared Sirius, grinning at Cecilia and sitting next to Remus on the arm of their settee. My parties are famous, Mrs. Frobisher — Infamous, muttered Remus, shaking his head. Do you know, Remus here was once sick for 3 days at Hedgewood's after one of my parties? 88,888,888. And everything you've told me's accurate, K-Lies. Aberforth looked over his half-moon spectacles, which would have reminded those who knew Albus Dumbledore of this wizard, had they been present. It was late evening and the party had been going for about an hour. Callias Lupin had come from the Ministry only after a long and intense discussion with Aberforth about the survivor from behind the veil. Callias nodded slowly. He didn't want to be there, not really. He much preferred the pleasure of his own company and felt awkward in social situations, probably accounted for by his prior affliction as a werewolf. Despite Severus Snape's perfected lycanthropy cures, old habits died hard. Absolutely, Aberforth. The Ministry, and when I say Ministry, I mean the Eras who are bound to report these things. They believe that Cecilia Frobisher's appearance was part of Severus's experiment. Even Lucius Malfoy's been embarrassed enough by her attack on him not to speak of it. I think it'll just die away, especially when people find out about the universal link. Excellent. You've worked really hard on this, Callias. Aberforth padded his way over to the door of his study and pushed down on the handle. Instead of moving, however, Callias Lupin remained where he was, staring towards the fire. Callias.K. Aberforth stroked his fine, wispy beard as he tried to get the wizard's attention. What? Callias looked sharply at Aberforth and shook his head. Is there anything else I need to know? Callias shook his head again, but held his look at Aberforth. It's just nothing really. Nothing to do with the situation at any rate. Cecilia. Mrs. Frobisher reminds me of someone. He sat down in the chair he had occupied earlier that evening, the one in which Cecilia had also resided that morning. Aberforth crossed the carpeted study and sat back down too, waiting for the elder Lupin brother to get whatever was worrying him off his mind. At length, Callias spoke. I remember a time, when I was reading my father's book, the one that Remus gave to that mole girl. I shouldn't have had it, but I used to like reading Grimelda on my own. Callias moved in his chair, and continued to stare towards the fireplace. I liked the storm, you see. In Grimelda, she walked through a storm and it set the scene very well. But that night. Fenrir Greyback, said Aberforth quietly, Callias looked from the fireplace to Aberforth and nodded. "Fenrir Greyback," he confirmed. "He bit me, as you know. But for some reason, when I first met Cecilia Frobisher I was taken back to that day when he fell out of my window. Greyback fell out. Tumbled out." Callias shook his head and got to his feet. "It was just strange. When I met her it was as if she was there." He let Aberforth Dumbledore open the door before passing through it this time and opened the door into the living room as Aberforth swished his wand, making the study fold into itself before slipping the little black square into his robe. Music was being played from a phonograph near the kitchen and the living room had been transformed into a dance floor, much as it had been in another time and place for a Christmas party, with the purple settees and tables around the outside. Unlike Christmas, summer flowers were hanging in sprays around the room and in vases, and the late evening sunshine was even now warming the room. Many reciprocators were there, looking a little out of place in such an atmosphere of frivolity and gaiety, and Callias began to feel a little sorry for them, empathizing with their plight. He noticed the Grimmauld Place reciprocators, Sirius, and James, Lily, Tabitha, and Snape, and Remus. All of them were engaged in an animated discussion about something, making Lily and Tabitha laugh shrilly and the wizards roar in mirth. His brother's friends were also in a state of mild intoxication, and he wondered whether Sirius's cousin really did mind babysitting Sam Potter as well as Freya Mitchell in Callias's grandmother's cottage in the Lake District. Callias was about to approach his brother and offer to get him a drink when Remus got to his feet suddenly. Callias found himself following his brother, who himself seemed to be following someone else, through into the kitchen. He watched Remus through the kitchen door, which was unusually absent of people milling around collecting and fetching, as he looked at her, Cecilia Frobisher, who was leaning on the balcony railing and staring out into the dulling view of number 12's garden. Then he watched his brother open the outer door to the balcony, closing it gently behind him. "Will she be all right?" Callias turned slowly to Aberforth, who had appeared silently by his side before glancing back at Remus, who now had his arm around her shoulders, the thin dress she had chosen to wear for the occasion doing nothing for her against the cool evening breeze. "We offered her something familiar, the child to look after. And I have offered her a position at Hedgewood's. Do you think that's wise? She'll have residual memory of her old life and what she did behind the veil." Callias looked out at his brother as he pulled Mrs. Frobisher closer to him, leaning over her. He wasn't surprised when Remus kissed her, slowly and tenderly, nor when Cecilia Frobisher didn't resist. "We're going to need someone like her, let's face it, she's going to need a purpose, and now what with our admitting of non-wizards and what my brother is doing and all that business in the Black Forest." "Grindelwald?" asked Callias, wondering how interesting Remus's life would now his brother had chosen to follow his instinct. Aberforth nodded slowly. "We're going to need her,